Vladimir Horowitz is one of the most influential artists of the 20th century, and for some he's the best pianist ever. I absolutely admire him as an artist, but I, as probably many of you, have always been puzzled about his technique, about his unique approach to piano playing. So in this video, I'm not going to speak about his interpretation, about his unique performer style, instead concentrating on his technique. For those of you who are new here, my name is Denis Zhdanov, and in addition to the art of interpretation in piano playing, I also concentrate myself a lot on safe, efficient, and healthy piano technique. If you are interested in checking out my courses or scheduling a lesson with me, please follow the link in the description. If you are a great fan of Vladimir Horowitz and not ready to look at any aspects connected with him from rather critical and analytical approach, please don't watch this video, because in this video I'm going to suggest a theory which might actually upset some of his most passionate fans. But in my opinion, in order to understand something, in order to get closer to truth, we have to be free of both negative and positive biases. Unfortunately, we have only very sparse recordings from his early period, but nevertheless, we can fish out something, we can analyze his approach to piano playing. So let's make a small experiment. I will sit lower, the way Horowitz usually does, and what you might see in his recordings, like literally throughout the whole career, is that he doesn't really move his elbows, and he tends to keep his wrists in a rigid position, so basically relying just on fingers. And of course, in this position, when you sit low and when you don't allow your arms to move around, to shape what you're actually doing with fingers, then of course the only option to switch position, for example, in such spots, is to really lift your fingers and throw them over. But the problem is that here you would use a lot of like extensors in order to do so, which loads this part of the hand. And additionally, I don't even know how he plays with a decent accuracy, because if I would play like this, well, it's horrible. feels terrible. The biggest problem is that it's very difficult to make it even, so I probably could play decently like this if I would invest like 3 times more practicing than I usually do in a piece. But I don't see any point, because not only it's difficult to control everything in this position, but also it loads both flexors and extensors. I literally feel how I'm fighting with myself, because that motion when you lift your fingers in order to deliver them to the next hand position is it takes a lot of energy. And a so-called contraction when you work with both flexors and extensors at the same time, it's one of the most frequent reasons for overuse issues, for piano playing related injuries for musicians. That's why it's not my thing. Definitely I'm not going to practice like that, because in the long perspective that would endanger me very much about getting some hand issues. On the contrary, if I would play in an efficient way by sitting a little bit higher and keeping my elbows always on the level with the keys, or even like slightly like half of an inch higher, and flipping over while hitting the thumb, so using the same rotational motion here in order to execute that flip over using forearm rotation and not extensors. Yeah. Then you see it feels much more comfortable, and it's less important whether you are warmed up properly or not when you perform like this, because when you play efficiently it feels comfortable. When you play inefficiently, you really have to warm up properly and make sure that you're in the best possible shape in order to execute those overwhelming little muscle movements. Yeah, that feels much more natural. And although this is not my main repertoire piece, I didn't actually perform it, and I just practiced it in order to make this comparison video. But I immediately feel that if I will keep practicing this way, I actually can master it and feel myself much safer on stage if I would perform it than if I would sit lower with rigid arm positions and moving a lot with fingers around like butterfly thing and stuff. It makes me feel really insecure. Of course, we can't compare the best pianist ever and some random guy from YouTube, but I find it important to show that there are different ways to play piano and different ways to resolve problems, and some of them are more sustainable than the others in the long run. And modern specialists who study piano physiology and piano efficiency draw a very distinct line between a short-term and long-term piano technique. A short-term technique might help you to build a reputation of a virtuoso, but since it's very much finger-oriented and the arms are mostly like in a rigid, tense position, it overwhelms your fingers, overwhelms your muscles, and in the longer run, it might lead to injury. And the brightest example of this kind of technique is Lang before his injury. And on the opposite pole, we have somebody like Marta Argerich, who plays as effortlessly in her 80s as she did 50 years ago. A Tokyo recital was an infamous disaster, and I know that the official version is that his doctor treated him with drugs which debilitated his coordination, and that's probably true, but the point of efficient piano technique is to help you survive even through very difficult situations when you are generally out of shape, when you can control your fingers only on a very limited scale. So when I was recovering from overuse issues, I have planned my motions in such a way that I would always have spots where I could get rid of tension, because when your fingers don't really listen to you and when they're weakened, when you can't really work with them efficiently, the worst thing to do is to try to break through a passage on a static tension. That doesn't work. You just get stuck. You just get in this kind of spasm, and this is exactly what happens here. We can clearly see it on the recording. So what I would do if I would feel that, okay, I'm really out of shape, I can control things only on a limited scale, I would make sure that I would plan spots within a passage where I could shake off the tension, for example, learning in groups. In my video about this etude and also Liszt 6 Rhapsody, I explained how to approach octave technique in a more user-friendly and safer fashion. On this historical recording, you can see how his left hand gains static tension while playing these octaves and fingers start to curl. We can see how his right hand fingers are clearly tense between octaves. There's also a good question whether you really need to lift your fingers so high by playing legato passages in a Chopin etude, but that's of course a question of interpretation. At the same time, in his other successful recording in a Polonaise in A-flat major, he's able to play octaves in a quite efficient way, and this is what puzzling me actually, because sometimes his playing seems really weird and extremely inefficient, and sometimes it looks extremely efficient, very comfortable, and exactly the way I would play it or I would teach it. Let's have a look at the etude number 8 in his later recording. It actually looks more ergonomic than his early recording, but there is no substantial change. You can see that there is no forearm rotation motion between positions, and because the wrist is positioned lower than the keyboard actually, a natural solution is to change positions by lifting the fingers so high. However, this loads extensors heavily and causes a so-called co-contraction when you use opposite muscles, flexors and extensors at the same time, basically fighting against yourself. So what I see is a man who is not a teenager anymore and probably goes through a very painful and difficult stage of life when his ability to play piano is limited by drug use and other health issues. And nevertheless, despite all that, he continues to play with an inefficient technique which might work only when you're very young and very strong. Here you can see a very typical approach of Horowitz to loud chords, and you can notice an absence of a so-called whipping motion when you'd first feel the necessary keys with fingertips and then provide a whipping impulse from the elbow. And also with some cushioning between keys, you make sure that you don't have a static tension for a group of chords. But he prefers to fall on the keys like an owl on the prey, which of course drastically decreases accuracy, although looks of course very impressive. And as you might see, he remains quite tense after the hit, so basically all the chords are played on one static tension, as opposed to the cushioning approach where you would release tension between hits. In this Scarlatti sonata, it's very clear that a low wrist and blocked elbow position doesn't allow to use advantage of rotational in and out motions, creating a huge amount of load of fingers. So let's conduct another experiment and see how it feels. So again, when you sit that low and when your elbows are lower than the key level, and if your wrists also are blocked in a rigid position, then of course the only solution here is to play with flattened fingers and move them around like a butterfly. Let's have a look. This is so unusual for me, I barely control what I'm doing, but again, I feel that I really have to practice when I play like this. And it's very difficult to make it really even, really pearly, and even listening to Horowitz recording, you might actually notice that it's almost even, almost. But if you sit in a proper position and if you allow your arms to shape what you're doing by using motions in the keyboard for fingers 3, 2, and out, then actually it's easier to manage that. And you're less dependent on speed limits, so basically you can play faster or slower. Of course, this piece is not about playing it crazily quickly, but it's nice when you actually can play it quicker by playing it efficiently, so then you feel more safe when you play in a tempo you want. Horowitz was praised for his incredible virtuosity from the very start of his career in the 1920s. His repertoire has included a great amount of brilliant virtuoso pieces, such as Transcendental Etudes, Don Juan Fantasy by Liszt, Brahms Paganini Variations, Schumann Toccata. Many of these pieces, however, have disappeared from his repertoire by the second half of his career. There is a great website with his concert history. Of course, there are not all his concerts, but this website gives us an idea about his approach to programming. During the first half of his career, you might see an incredible range of publicly performed works. Sometimes he would change a program every day. Horowitz have had a few lengthy sabbaticals where he didn't perform publicly, but have occasionally produced some recordings. The longest one, the longest sabbatical, was 12 years long, from 1953 to 65. The reasons are a little bit obscure, and they might be very complex, I suppose, but depression and exhaustion is the official version.
Rising planes, changing rooms, changing town, it's not so easy, no?
In his 30s, he gave up to 100 recitals a year, and no wonder that this was simply too overwhelming. When you have such an incredible load, it's drastically important to have a sustainable, healthy technique. What we also can see that after 1965, he's extremely cautious about which pieces to perform publicly, and those are mostly pieces which he already plays since a very young age, since the very start of his career. What we also know that Horowitz had a piano with an extra light action in his later age. His repertoire for public performances diminished with age drastically, and we see that he had a very unique technique. If we reverse these points, we get a following theory. Horowitz had a unique technique that, while worked for him when young, began to limit his capacities when old, forcing him to shrink his repertoire to a limited amount of pieces he dared to play publicly. As a result, he had a piano built with an even lighter action to help him continue to perform despite the lack of substantial change in his technical approach. It's also worth mentioning that his student Gary Grafman, who studied with him for a few years, got a focal dystonia, the most serious neurological disorder typically caused by inefficient technique habits and playing through pain. This strengthened me in my opinion that Vladimir Horowitz had inherited a piano school that promotes a usage of isolated fingers with kind of blocked and rather rigid arms, what we exactly have seen in his recordings, and he wasn't informed about an efficient approach to piano playing where the arm would be used as a unit, when all the bodily parts would be properly connected, which can be tracked all the way back to Frédéric Chopin's approach to piano playing. This not only limited him throughout his career, but also didn't allow him to warn his students about dangerous playing habits which can easily end one's career. I'm doing this video not in order to criticize Horowitz or undermine his reputation. He was an incredibly bright artist, and even when his playing wasn't technically accurate, it surely was musically and emotionally enriching and worth listening to. For example, even the most disastrous version ever of the octave etude from his Tokyo recital has the most beautiful middle section I've ever heard. Furthermore, as an artist and personal brand, he is surely one of the most successful individuals, combining a seductively rebel character.
I'm not very interesting for you people. No.
Brilliant sense of humor. Incredible passion and charisma balanced by extreme sensitivity and tenderness. An artist who knew exactly how to promote and sell himself in the most efficient and profitable way possible. Furthermore, if my theory is right, it makes me actually to admire him even more, because one thing is to remain a star when your technical capacities are limitless. And another thing is to maintain this superstar status when you have to be very cautious about what would you dare to play and how to plan your preparation to public performances, so you would get, on the one hand, prepared enough, but on the other hand, not overworked, not running into overuse issues again. But if his early approach to piano playing really wasn't very sustainable in a long run and was indeed somewhat limiting at the later stages of his career, and this is exactly what all the evidence is pointing on, we must know this, and we have right to research on this despite overly emotional reactions of people who prefer worshipping and cultish idolization instead of research and scientific non-biased questioning approach to things, because this is a point where it's not about only Horowitz anymore, but about every other emerging piano player. We need to have answers to these questions for the sake of developing such a technique which would allow the next generation of pianists to avoid injury and overuse issues. Thank you for watching this. If you are interested in my approach to piano playing, please check out my courses or contact me for an online piano lesson. Please write in comments whether this material resonates with you, whether you agree or not, and what is your position regarding this issue. Thank you for watching this. Have fun playing piano and see you next time.